Apologies in advance for the terrible editing and voiceover here, but I thought for the first video I'm posting, I'll start by showing how I've built, pretty much for free, a very sturdy workbench that can be easily moved about on casters, and that matches the height of the other workstations I have in my garage. So the first step is to figure out how much material I actually had to work with. I've been given an old dining table and a bed that were both surplus to requirements, and I started by breaking down the bed. I got 14 or so usable slats out of this, and I then started separating those from the ribbon they were connected to. You might be wondering why I actually need to build a workbench, as the table I'm working on here seems to be doing a pretty good job, but it doesn't quite have the structural integrity if I'm going to use this for woodworking, and it can't actually be easily moved. It's also a little bit too low. So after a lot of thinking, I think the easiest thing to do was just to replace the legs with a custom frame that fits the requirements I need. So with the slats broken down, I could start sorting them into piles that alternated in the direction of the bowing, and that way once they're laminated together, the bowing should offset. I could then figure out how tall I needed to actually build my legs. So I started by measuring the workbench I currently had, which was 96 centimeters. From there I can work out the lengths I needed to cut the wood, by first taking away the height of the worktop, 2.5 centimeters, and then the height of the casters, which is 10 centimeters, away from the 96. The remaining height, being the length of legs I need, is 83.5 centimeters. So I know that the worktop I've got is 74 centimeters wide, and using that and the 83.5 just calculated, I can work out the lengths of cuts I need to make. From there I can work backwards to figure out the remaining lengths I need to cut for the lamination process to work, and give me the mortises and tenons that line up accurately. Once cut, I should have these 24 pieces of wood. I don't have a miter saw, so to cut the boards to length, I put the sled on the table saw and I attached a long strip of wood that acted as a fence extension. I cut a slit into that fence, and I could then use that to put the end of the tape measure in and measure the lengths I needed to cut. Following that, I marked the first length with a pencil, and then I added a scrap bit of wood to add as a stop block with a clamp. So I could then make the cuts I need by pushing the wood up against that block and then pushing the sled through the saw. And I can then repeat that for the number of lengths I need to cut. I made a bit of a mistake here, and I didn't use a strong enough clamp for my fence extension, so it moved over slightly and resulted in some lengths being cut long. I beefed up the clamps holding the fence, and I ran the affected bits of wood back through again. I could then just repeat this process for all the other lengths that I needed to cut according to the plans. Once all cut to length, I could organise the wood into piles and then start to assemble them into the legs. I double checked the plans for which bit of wood needed to go where, and then I could start putting them into the piles ready for glue. And you can see here how the mortise and tenons should work once they're laminated together. So I then cut a few spacer blocks, and I used these to ensure that the wood was correctly aligned when being glued up. This let me have an even overhang on both ends, and I could then start the process of clamping them together. I didn't have my nail gun set up at this point, so I was unfortunately relying on some very painfully sub-ideal clamps. I had to temporarily hold the wood in place with the weak clamps before swapping them to the stronger ones once the first set being glued had finished drying a little bit. After I've done a few of these, I decided to use my brain a little bit, and I figured out that I could clamp 2 sets at a time, and this helped speed up the process. You can see here I've also added a clamp to help with alignment when some of the boards slid a little bit. So with that set done, I decided to do the connecting pieces as one big batch using the larger clamps. This is much the same as the previous process, so I've tried to speed it up, And you can see that after I had a bit of a fight with the glue bottle, I eventually managed to get everything covered in glue and stuck together. Please excuse the terrible camera angle I put it back to after it fell, but here I'm just adding a little bit of salt to stop the board sliding about once they're being clamped together, as this happened with the set before. So with everything starting to dry, it was finally time to assemble the legs by slotting the pieces together to make the two frames. I only captured the end of this process, having built the first set of legs off camera, but hopefully this gives you a clear indication of how it slots together. So once they were crudely bashed together, I clamped all the joints as tight as they would go, and then I added a couple of screws to each corner to add a bit of strength. I'm avoiding gluing these for now just to make it easier to take apart when I can afford to eventually upgrade this to a more thoughtfully designed workbench. With the legs together, I could then start taking apart the table, which I make look way more painful than it should be here. And once apart, I can start constructing the connecting braces to form the base of the workbench. With the table apart, I can figure out what material I've got left after taking apart the table and seeing what was left of the bed. From there I can come up with the simplest box design I could think of to maximize the size of the frame and therefore the workbench that I can make. I set my table saw fence to the same width as the slats, and I ripped all the material to that width. I'll try and speed up this process as it's pretty repetitive, but I might take the opportunity to just say, if you've got any feedback about how the video is flowing or anything you think could be improved, let me know and I'll try and address it in the next video. So with everything ripped to the width I need, I can add my stop block to my sled as I did earlier, and then cut everything to the lengths. Again, this is the same process as earlier, so I'll try and speed it up. With everything cut to length, I could start pre-drilling and then driving in screws to make a simple box. With the benefit of hindsight, a bit of glue would probably help with rigidity here, as I'm not going to reuse this wood, but I add this later, so it wasn't too big of an issue. With two of those boxes built, I could start attaching them to the legs I built earlier to build the frame. I've again done this with simple screws just to allow for this to be disassembled in the future, but if you're going to build one, glue would definitely help to make this a more solid connection and probably reduce a bit of the racking I experienced. With the shell of the frame now built, it was time to add the casters to the bottom. Sadly, I realised the legs I built were too thin for the plate the casters I bought, so I had to take some scrap off cuts of wood, measure those to length, and then cut them on the sled to fit the gap. Once cut, I could add a bit of glue and secure them in place with a nail gun, which by this point I'd got working. After I'd let the glue set for a little while, I could then screw the feet into each corner. With the wheels on, it was finally time to attach the base to the top. I chose to use simple L brackets to do this as I had some lying around, but again there's probably more secure ways to do this, including using a bit of glue. With screws holding the top on, I could then make flipping it over look really difficult, and then the shell of the workbench was finally done. As I mentioned earlier, without having used any glue in this build, I found the bench was racking a fair bit, so I had to finally cave in and buy a little bit of plywood to finish this project. I measured it to the right length, and then I cut it down using a very crude homemade track saw. I then nailed this to the base and one side to stop it from racking. If you haven't got a nail gun, screws would have also done the job just fine. Thankfully for everyone involved, that's the workbench complete. I actually ended up replacing the side panel, but I'll make another video on why I did that. This is part of a couple of upgrades I've been making to this table since I built it. Again, this is the first video I've put out, so if there's anything you liked, let me know, or more probably what you didn't, and who knows, maybe I'll address it at some point in the future.